The Lost Princess, Chapter 13, Ryla returned to the ship. She selected to go down an alternative corridor, far less spacious, yes, but quite hidden and out of the way. Food in hand, she quickly walked down the lengthy umbilical before setting foot inside of the craft and shutting the port behind her. She paused for a moment and turned back around. The port had been opened before she arrived. She glanced around the living quarters of the ship, empty. Katerna had yet to return, apparently, and the human was nowhere to be seen. David? Nothing. Her frills shifted purple. She sensed a new smell, quite vile, yes, but also distinctly foreign. A loud thump came from the cargo hold, followed by another. Cautious, Ryla silently set the 2 boxes of food inside of a storage container. She slowly started towards the cargo hold. David? Another thump, followed by a yell. Ryla froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper. David? Bam! The human exploded through the door, grappling with a Ravinian male about equal his size. The stranger had his fingers around David's throat. Ryla watched horror as he slammed David into the wall. David repeatedly used his elbow to break the stranger's grip. The two yelled and struggled as they thrashed about the living quarters. David eventually managed to break free and landed a severe blow to the stranger's exposed chest, to which the stranger himself responded with a heavy slug to the sweaty face of the human. Ryla stood, petrified, as the two duked it out within the cramped confines of the ship. She felt as though there was nothing she could do. She noticed an insignia tattooed on the stranger's shoulder, the band of Arjman blazon. This stranger was a bounty hunter. David managed to kick the back of the bounty hunter's knee, sending him to floor. He wrestled with him for a moment before grabbing hold of the man's head. David's other fist became a blur. He repeatedly socked the side of the bounty hunter's head, causing blood to pour out of his ear and nearly beating the man unconscious. David then gripped the back of the man's head and slammed his skull against the corner of a storage unit. Again and again and again, another bounty hunter barged out of the cargo, this one skinnier and more limber. He pummeled through Ryla as if she were nothing, sending the princess skidding across the polished floor. He seemed to pay her no mind. Every ounce of his being was focused squarely on the human. Right before David was to slam the larger man's cranium against the storage container once more, the newcomer bodied him and tackled him to the floor. He managed to position himself atop the human before launching a flurry of punches. David put up his arms in a defensive position, shielding himself from most of his attacks. The bounty hunter managed to pry apart David's shield and dealt a successful blow to his head, followed by another. The human was powerful, yes, but he was losing steam. He turned to face her. Ryla, get out of here. Bam. Another blow to the head. Blood trickled from David's nose. He needed help, now. Ryla, who had previously sat in the corner watching as the fight ensued, began to frantically search for something she could use as a weapon, anything, there. Her eyes landed on the electric baton lying on the floor. It must have been knocked from David's grasp. Frantic, she scrambled towards the baton and wrapped her hands around its hilt. She stood up and thumbed the sensor. The baton crackled to life. Her focus shifted towards the attacker. Her frills burned hotly, not with fear, but anger. She let out a cry as she started towards the bounty hunter, baton raised. Her weapon hummed as it cut through the air, before colliding with the attacker's head. He seemed disoriented for a moment before quickly recollecting his bearings. Her strike was far less potent than she had anticipated. The attacker briefly turned his attention to Ryla. You bitch. She started to swing again, but he caught her wrist. He twisted her arm with a sickening crunch, sending pangs of pain firing all through Ryla's body. She cried out in unbelievable agony before he pried the baton from her grip and shoved her away. He then turned to the human, baton in hand, but David took advantage of Ryla's diversion. He landed a single, powerful blow to the side of the bounty hunter's face, knocking him unconscious. His chest heaved up and down as he regained his breath. He retook possession of the baton before weakly standing up. His attention shifted to Ryla. She held her broken arm close to her chest. He knelt beside her. You all right? She winced. Do I look all right? She responded through gritted teeth. No, he chuckled. Not really. Ryla mustered a weak laugh. Something about the human's expression. For the briefest of moments, she felt oddly at ease. It only now that she realized how injured he was. Blood flowed from his broken lip and fresh bruises covered his face. The skin around his left eye was darkened and swollen, he could barely keep it open. Perspiration dripped down his contusion-laden face. Her stomach churned for a moment. For a second, she forgot all about her broken arm. All she could focus on was the sweaty, smelly, bruised, affable man kneeling before her. Then another figure came into view, charging towards the human. Time seemed to move in slow motion. Her eyes went wide. "David, behind you." In one fluid motion, the human spun around and swung his baton. He stuck a female bounty hunter across the face, effectively swatting her towards the umbilical port. She collided against the wall with her back and slumped to the ground. Another bounty hunter stumbled through the cargo hold door, clearly quite dazed. He was armed with an energy rifle. His eyes locked with Ryla's for a moment and a look of realization crossed his face. "You." "David, he's got a gun." Ryla called. David snapped around, but it was too late. Before he could respond, the newcomer quickly raised his rifle and fired 3 quick shots, striking the human in the chest. David was sent stumbling backwards into the wall and slouched to the floor, utterly defeated. His shoulders drooped and his neck went limp. "David!" Ryla cried. There was no response. She felt tears well in her eyes. "David!" The bounty hunter ignored her entirely. He stepped over the bodies of his allies as he approached the alien. Breathless, he nudged David's head with the barrel of his gun. "No response, fucking animal." He muttered. He slung the gun over his shoulder and offered a hand to the woman that David had batted away. She dazedly obliged, and, with great effort, he managed to pull her to her feet. Ryla's arm was swelling with blood now, but no amount of pain could prevent her from directing her rage towards the 2 bounty hunters standing before her. "You monsters!" They ignored her again. The male offered the woman a cloth, which she used to pat down the side of her face that David had struck. It had been utterly demolished. "In the king's name." "What was that thing?" The male panted and shook his head. "I dunno. Fucker hit me hard, Cromman, the rough equivalent of brother." She muttered. She removed the cloth from her face. It was covered in blood. "Fuck." They spoke with distinct accents common to those that lived within the periphery. The woman watched as the male got down and inspected the human further. "You think it's dead?" "Not sure." He responded before standing back up. He glanced wildly around the room before pointing at the first man Ryla saw David fight. His head had been thoroughly crushed by the face of storage unit, killed him. He then pointed at the scrawnier attacker. "He's alive now, but his head's swelling. Won't be livin' much longer." Ryla's gaze fell on the second attacker. His forehead had nearly doubled in size since the human knocked him out. It was the female's turn to shake her swollen head. "Damn shame, you know." "Yep." He male grabbed the electric baton. He casually ignited it and pointed it at Ryla. "And looky here. The lost princess." The woman chuckled. She let her towel fall. "Who'da fucking thought?" Ryla glowered with rage. She flared her frills. "Fuck you. Bitch has got a fire in her." The male laughed. "Tell me. What's someone like you doing all the way out here?" Ryla responded only with a glare. "The king might not be able to track this here ship, but we can." He continued. "So it was you who killed Lady Amanthra?" "Huh? Or was it him?" More silence. "Anyways. Didn't they raise the bounty on this here princess?" He asked. "Yep. 200 million credits, as of yesterday." The woman responded. He let out a breath. "Well, we got what we came here, and a lot extra. Unfortunate for our fallen compatriots here, but they will receive a hero's torching. And that alien, if he's alive, could make a good fighter. Stand her up and lock her." He motioned towards Ryla. "This is the most valuable woman in all the galaxy. Be sure to treat her extra nice." "I hear." She dismissed before disappearing into the cargo hold. The male began moving the bodies around the ship. She returned shortly afterward with a pair of cuffs. She grabbed Ryla's arm and tried pulling her up. The princess refused. "Up." Ryla shook her head. A feeble attempt at defiance, but what was she to do? The woman lifted her up with great effort. "Turn around." Ryla didn't budge. Turn around. The princess' eyes drifted toward David. The position of his head had changed. He lay slumped on the floor, his head against the wall, allowing him a full view of the room. He could barely open his eyes. He made a motion with his chin, directing Ryla's attention towards a gun holstered around the woman's waist. Ryla immediately understood. Turn around. The woman ordered again. In a blindingly quick motion, Ryla used her free arm to rip the gun from the woman's holster. She pressed the muzzle of the gun against the woman's exposed abdomen. She glared into her eyes. Fuck you. She thumbed the trigger. Blue light poured from the pistol, blasting a hole through the woman. She fired again and again and again. Life faded from the woman's eyes as her body crumpled to the floor. Urinsa! The other bounty hunter yelled. Ryla braced as he started towards her, unable to raise her gun in time. Then David sprang to life. The human slammed into the attacker, flattening him against the opposite wall and causing the ship to rock back and forth. He struck the bounty hunter in the head, knocking him to the floor, and then kneed his head against the wall. The man slumped to the floor. Dead. The human let out a heavy breath. He nearly fell before quickly catching his step. Ryla darted towards him to assist him, but he waved his hand. I'm fine. I'm fine. Take off your shirt. Ryla ordered. David weakly chuckled. You really? Take off your shirt. Ryla repeated. He sighed. Slowly and achingly, he managed to remove his shirt. Massive bruises dotted his chest, areas where the bounty hunter had shot him. He couldn't keep his eyes off her face. Ryla swallowed. Thank you, David. If you didn't. No, thank you. David responded. He gestured towards his chest. Don't worry, I'll take care of all this. No, just lay down in the cargo hold. There's some supplies there. She instructed. You need to heal. His eyes fell towards her broken arm. But you need. Ryla placed a delicate hand on his cheek. The human didn't wince. She moved closer towards his head. I'll be fine. She whispered. They lingered there for some time. A sound from across the room drew their attention. Both of them turned to face the umbilical port, which slid open. Katerna stood there, frozen, carrying large bags of supplies and food in each hand. Her eyes went to the bodies that littered the floor, the guns scattered across the room, the blood pooling on the polished floor and smeared across the surface of the storage unit, then to Ryla and David. Her mouth fell open. What did I miss? The Lost Princess, Chapter 14. God, I look like shit. David leaned towards the digital mirror. His hair was a wet and oily mess. Dark spots hung under his tired eyes. The swelling around his left eye had subsided somewhat over the past few weeks or so, although the skin around it was still purple and sore. His nose looked all warped and distorted. A subtle, ragged beard had appeared on his chin and lower cheeks that needed to be taken care of. His eyes traveled further down. The rest of his body hadn't fared much better. 3 massive bruises for 3 shots to his chest, one directly on his pectoral, another near his heart, and one more on his side. In total, he'd sustained 2 broken ribs in his fight. A fractured sternum, a black eye, and a broken nose. Not since that brawl in Barmanara had he or the girls encountered any more bounty hunters, or any ship at all, for that matter. Eerie, he placed a delicate finger on the bruise on his side before quickly retracting it, wincing at the very touch. Energy weapons, as it turned out, didn't quite work like kinetic weapons. They all had the force of a speeding bullet, but without any bullet to be seen, and neither the princess healing ointment nor the more heavy-duty medical bed present on the bounty hunter's ship proved to be of much help. The former could only be effectively applied to surface-level cuts and the like, while the latter, as described by Ryla, was quite complex and not designed with your anatomy in mind. A slight smile appeared on his face once the princess realized he had been shot not once, not twice, but 3 times. Initially, she had seemingly assumed that only the first shot landed. Somehow, she was stricken with awe. Such a feat, apparently, was quite unheard of. Back at the academy, he had actually been shot with a Bisnean pistol as part of a training exercise. It felt like a young little leaguer had thrown a baseball at him. Painful? Not really. Sore? A little. Surprising? Definitely, like a glass of cold water being thrown at your face. But this, he grimaced again, this hurt. He picked up his oddly shaped knife, not his knife, per se, as it was previously in the possession of the bounty hunters, and put the blade to his cheek. Slowly, he began scraping at the skin. Tiny bits of hair fluttered down into the glowing basin below. When he was done, he wet his face and wiped the remaining hairs away. He peered back into the mirror, dashing as always, Commander. GAIA complimented. David playfully shook his head. Give me a break. I should let you know, David, that I do believe our dear Princess Ryla prefers a clean-shaven look. Not a simple fashion norm. Ravinians, in fact, cannot grow hair at all. To see such a hairy and intelligent thing must have come to her as quite a shock. Don't you have better things to do? David smiled. I'm sure offering me fashion advice so the princess may be pleased is pretty far down on your list of priorities. To answer your first question, no, I don't, believe it or not. My incessant teasing was designed to make my presence among humans more pleasant and agreeable. However, while I do believe such is true, I must admit that I do take genuine pleasure in our menial interactions. I believe you humans call it fun. On a tangentially related note, Commander, I must stress that you keep your eyes on the prize. What do you mean? He asked. I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. GIA answered. You cannot possibly believe that I am not privy to your thoughts regarding the princess, especially those that have developed since your brawl with those bounty hunters. I have no idea as to what you're talking about. Oh, Commander, but I do. She continued. I've seen how you act around her. I've measured the changes in your heart rate. My heart rate? As part of my passive health monitoring program, yes, but that's quite beside the point. GIA explained. Commander, with all due respect, you took an oath. Now I understand that any man or woman of your age in a position such as your own will inevitably feel deprived. But you must continue to pursue your goal of returning to the front. You must persevere. David remained silent. At the risk of sounding horrifically trite, I must state this, the allure of exotic alien space babes is fleeting. Commander. The greatness of mankind is eternal. What did she just say? David was about to respond when a single, solitary knock came from the door. He turned back towards the mirror. This conversation isn't over. Wincing, he slipped his shirt back on. You can come in. Behind the door, Ryla drew in a sharp breath. She pursed her lips and preened her frills, an odd task to perform with a single arm. She pressed her hand against the sensor, prompting the door to slide open. David was there, examining himself in the mirror. He turned to face her. His eyes fell towards her sling. How's your arm? Fine. She lied. Truthfully, the pain was excruciating, more so than any injury she had sustained in her life. She was healing quickly, faster than the human, anyway, but she would have to wear the support for another week at the very least. David seemed to sense her fib, but he didn't say anything about it. Katerna instructed me to inform you that we are due to arrive at the Marlala system within a half hour. The human seemed to perk up. He nodded. All right, I'll be down in a second. Ryla dipped her head in acknowledgement and turned away. The door closed behind her. That was weird. She started towards the cockpit. David's demeanor had shifted greatly since he last warded off those violent ruffians. He'd grown more quiet, more insulated. There was a conflict being waged in his head, that much was clear, but between what and why? She had no clue. It was as though he were actively trying to distance himself from her. He was tempted by something. Was it Ravinia, a relative solace from the war that has enveloped his people? Was it some thirst for adventure, after so long being ordered around? Was it empathy for her people and her position in this unfolding conflict here in the kingdom? Or was it her frills flashed pink at the thought, as cruel as she knew it to be. She had never been a scholar in hiding her emotions. She stepped into the roomy cockpit, where Katerna monitored the ship's controls. You're here. Good. She greeted dryly. And David? He'll be down in a second. Her aide nodded. We will exit the slipstream about 3 light hours away from Marlala. Ryla looked at Katerna with concern. Why's that? The usurper has placed an all-encompassing embargo on the sector. Yes. To combat a defiant system, I heard. Ryla agreed. Her brow furrowed. Do you think Marlala is that system? There are 3 major inhabited systems in this sector, Katerna said. Marlala is an industrial powerhouse. Its governor was quite loyal to your father. Of the 3 systems in question, I believe Marlala to be the most likely to defy the usurper's rule. Ryla shuddered. So, we might be in a war zone right now? Katerna swiveled to face her. My dear princess, we are in a war zone. Truthfully, I'm surprised we have not yet encountered any members of the usurper's navy. Perhaps their ships are concentrated elsewhere. There was silence between the two for a moment. Katerna turned back towards the controls. We cannot get a faithful picture of the system until we stop, and I'd rather not do so in the midst of an enemy fleet, she said. We will exit the slipstream within 30 seconds. Our scan of the system, thanks to this vehicle's robust surveying instruments, should not take very long at all. David appeared then. He was wiping his head with a towel. Humans, it appeared, seemed to relish in being rather dry, a far cry from the Ravinians' biological need for moisture. Ryla watched as he moved towards the controls. What's in the sky? He asked. She frowned. In the sky. Had the human gone mad? They were in space. After all. She opened her mouth to question David when he shook his head. Sorry. Translation error. What's up? That made more sense. We will be stopping momentarily, she answered. Within seconds, the craft slammed into real space. Stars turned back from streaks to points of light, and the muffled whines of the ship's engines slowly faded. Ryla and Katerna jerked forward slightly, while David barely moved at all. The orb that Katerna controlled returned to its spherical form. We're here, Katerna announced. She placed her hands back over the orb. Commencing scan. Ryla swallowed. From here, the system's star appeared quite distant, though it did outshine most every star in view. The position of the planets were expanded and overlaid atop the windshield. There were 20 planets in total, although fewer than half of those were in view. Marlala was visible, a faint speck of blue in a sea of black, finding all craft in the system with a military signature, Katerna said. Instantly, thousands more objects became highlighted, largely clustered around Marlala and its neighboring worlds. Ryla put a hand to her mouth. Katerna leaned back in her seat. David simply stared on. It appears that this is no simple embargo. Marlala is under siege, her aide muttered. 11,934 ships in total. That's about 3/4 of the Ravinian navy right there. The usurper is throwing all the kingdom's military weight upon this system. She pointed at Marlala's sister planets. These are agricultural worlds, mostly. They've cut Marlala off from its extraplanetary resources entirely. Its fleets have been totally destroyed. Do you think your contact is even there? David asked. Katerna thought for a moment. He's an admirable man, but he's also quite stubborn. He'll be there, as long as worse hasn't happened to him. Ryla looked towards her pilot. Can we even reach Marlala without being caught? Katerna thought for some time. It will be difficult, princess, but it's doable. Our ship's tracking signature is discreet. They can find us, but they would have to really look hard. The conditions on the surface must be unimaginable. Ryla finished. A hushed silence fell upon the cockpit. Katerna had her eyes trained on the princess. Princess Ryla. Do you think you can do this? She asked. Do understand that this is the point of no return. Are you ready to fully commit to our present course of action? Ryla concentrated on that faint, blue speck. Her eyes then went to the human, standing firmly beside her. There could only be one answer, she nodded, a fierce flame in her eye. Yes. Kilier Vokasica sat at his desk, reading the latest updates on the war raging over Marlala. Current projection indicated that total, unconditional capitulation would occur within a month. Optimistic? Probably. But Kilier would rather not dwell in cynicism. Suddenly, a chime emitted from the elevator, followed by the whoosh of a rotating car. The door slid open easily. Kilier lifted his eyes to view his visitor, Dini Bosura, the head of planetary security on Old Ravinia. He quickly swiped away the status updates. Dini bowed and stood at attention. What brings you here? Kilier asked curtly. His countenance had become less pleasant over the course of the past week. "My king." A woman claiming to be a handmaiden of the lost princess appeared at our headquarters in the commercial sector. Killier's interest was piqued. His frills briefly shifted red. "A handmaiden? She claims to be Lien Bosun, one of TH. I know perfectly well who Lien is." Killier interrupted, eager to get to the point. "And she turned herself in willingly?" "It appears so, my king," Dini affirmed. "She claims to know the whereabouts of Princess Ryla, but she will only speak to you directly." Killier thought for a moment. He nodded. "Bring her here, quickly." Dini bowed. "Yes, my king." The Lost Princess, Chapter 15. Interstellar warfare is a complicated thing. Any spacefaring species, logically, possesses a survival instinct. Otherwise, such a race could never have touched the stars. And, again, logically speaking, any species or faction that possesses a survival instinct will make an effort to defend itself. On a stellar level, such defensive efforts typically involve the installation of long-range turrets and sentries as means to deter superluminal nuclear weapons. Fleets are constructed to perform regular patrols of the region, simultaneously ensuring the continued existence of order on a faction's outlying possessions and acting a bulwark against foreign threats. It is among the stars where the majority of interstellar conflicts between rival factions, be they divided across special, as in, relating to species, religious, political, or ideological lines, are fought. Once a faction's defenses have been thoroughly defeated, it is common for said faction to surrender, lest they be annihilated in nuclear hellfire or subject to a prolonged campaign of extermination, usually to the point of surrender, over the course of years or even decades. This was not the case on the world of Marlala. Across the system and its sister systems, hastily established defense systems lay in ruins. The vast majority of its fleet, save for a few holdouts scattered across the kingdom, had been either destroyed in battle or taken over by the king's navy. The agricultural worlds and stations that littered the system, which Marlala had so closely depended upon for tens of thousands of years, had been cut off entirely from their mother planet, yet Marlala still possessed the ultimate ace up its sleeve, industry. The factories that kept the Marlalan Independent Navy alive for months could be repurposed to build surface-to-air weapons that could destroy the king's ships. They could manufacture guns and bows that civilians could use to defend themselves. Perhaps most importantly, however, was the value inherent to Marlala's industrial complex. The planet alone comprised half of the kingdom's manufacturing potential. Had the system possessed a population to match its astounding industry, it's quite likely Marlala could have taken the fight all the way to the royal palace, but this was not the case. This left the king and his navy with three options. Option number 1, Glass Marlala. A cost-effective choice? Perhaps. But again, the impressive industry of Marlala had taken tens of thousands of years to build and would take tens of thousands more to rebuild, whether on the smoking remains of the planet's surface or elsewhere. Plus, such a measure would be an act of genocide since unseen in hundreds of generations, such actions were typically frowned upon. Especially considering that Marlalans were, ultimately, Ravinians. Option number 2, invade Marlala. Far from cost-effective, and perhaps even more deadly than choosing to glass the planet. In order to accomplish an invasion against such a well-armed opponent, billions of troops would have to be brought in from all across the kingdom. During this build-up period, the Marlalans would be able to convert their world into a fortress and arm themselves to the teeth, more so than they already had, anyway. While the invading force might come out on top by the end, the losses in lives and equipment would be unimaginable. Option number 3, besiege Marlala. Ugly? Very. Time-consuming? Possibly. Without access to food sourced from their agricultural worlds, Marlala would begin to starve in a matter of weeks. Stores of medicine and other sought-after goods would also run dry. Civil unrest would erupt across the planet, either forcing the rebellious governor to capitulate or ousting the government entirely, plunging the whole world into total anarchy. This process could be hastened by strategic bombing campaigns that targeted critical infrastructure, not enough to obliterate Marlala's valuable industry, but enough to halt the fomenting of any organized resistance movement. King Killier specifically directed that population centers not be targeted, lest ardent opposition to his rule emerge from all corners of his kingdom. Naturally, it was the third option that was selected. Having vanquished the Marlalan Independent Navy and successfully secured the system's less populated worlds, thousands of the king's ships closed in on Marlala, It was these ships that Katerna carefully dodged and evaded as she piloted a stolen bounty hunter's ship towards Marlala. She delicately weaved in and out of the enemy ship's spheres of detection, making slipstream hops wherever she could and deliberately masking her signature, or such was the case, at least, until Ryla spotted a hostile vessel break from the enemy formation and start towards their craft. She frowned. Over the past few hours, she had taken to poring over a holographic chart of the system. Not once had she seen this happen. She watched as the enemy vessel, represented by a red dot, separated from the rest of its fleet. Katerna. She turned. I think you might want to see this. Must you be so vague, my dear princess? Katerna responded curtly, clearly preoccupied with piloting their craft. Can you not see that I am quite busy? I think someone's detected us. Ryla said. She turned back towards the holographic display. 80,000 miles and closing. We must maintain course. Katerna responded. She was quiet for a moment. I will try to spoof our signal, perhaps they will try to follow the apparition. 80,000 miles, that's almost within visibility range. No amount of spoofing is gonna matter then. David murmured. He leaned over Katerna's shoulder. You should speed up. Just a bit. Katerna relaxed a little in the human's presence. I suppose you have the most experience in this department, being a fighter pilot and all. Increasing speed. The ship jerked forward slightly. Ryla continued to watch the live chart. No response to our spoof, he's staying course. They have also increased their speed. The current distance between our ships is 70,000 miles. No, 65. An indicator appeared on the windshield. The hostile vessel was sending a signal. This is the captain of the Garagalo speaking. Craft #3A856, you are flying in an active conflict zone. By the order of the king, decelerate immediately and prepare to be boarded. Failure to do so will result in the destruction of your craft. Silence in the cockpit. Ben turned to Katerna, who turned to Ryla, who had also turned to face the two. What do we do now? She asked. More silence. The way I see it, we have only a few options. Katerna started finally. We could obey the captain's orders and be boarded. Mind you that their vessel is tenfold the size of our own. Any fight we could stage would be put down within due time. Alternatively, we could surrender. I would certainly be tried and executed by the end of the month. The princess would become slave to the usurper for the rest of her life, and gods know what they would do with our alien guest. Or we could accelerate and speed towards Marlala. We're within reach of the planet now. Doing so would attract a ton of unwanted attention, but it's quite possible that we can reach the surface intact. Or, David chimed in suddenly. We could turn around and hightail it out of here. This ship is pretty light and equipped with some powerful engines to boot. There's no way they could catch us. He shook his head. I'm not gonna let you two killed, or worse, just so you guys can try to get me back to my people. There's gotta be another way. It hurt David to say those words, especially when freedom was so close. But whenever he looked at her, her kind face and understanding eyes, the more his resolve strengthened. He couldn't possibly bear to lose her. Katerna's eyes fell to the floor. The choice is yours, princess. Another blanket of silence fell upon the cockpit. Ryla leaned back in her seat, contemplating silently. An image of their poor, dilapidated cabin appeared in her mind. The starving children fighting over scraps of food on Barmanara station. And then David, smiling, as she fitted a fresh bandage around his chest. Then she returned to the cockpit, and the two, expectant pairs of eyes staring at her, she turned towards Katerna. Her eyes narrowed. Accelerate. What? The two exclaimed in unison. We've come too far and we've seen too much. I've seen too much, to turn back now. She reflected. Her frills flushed red. David has been nothing but kind and courteous towards us. This is our best shot, perhaps our only shot, to reunite him with his people. And the condition of my kingdom has worsened greatly over the course of my absence. She added. The people are suffering. As princess, it is my duty to protect and defend my people. And I cannot do that while cowering away on some far-off moon on the fringe of the periphery. This deadly charade ends here and now. Ryla declared forcefully. Accelerate. Katerna gave a heavy nod. As you wish, my princess. She spun around to the controls. David moved towards Ryla, concern in his eyes. Are you sure about this? Ryla smirked. Surer than I ever have. The two shared a moment together, cut short by a call from Katerna. Accelerating. The ship lunged forward. David moved towards Katerna. How long until we reach Marlala? Not long at all, was the simple reply. Commencing hop. She rotated her hand around the holographic sphere. For a split second, the universe went completely white. The planet Marlala appeared suddenly, consuming their whole view. Smoke and wispy clouds obscured most of the surface from sight. Thousands of ships hung in orbit, pounding the world with bombs. Massive, glowing fires raged violently in the regions where night had fallen. David's eyes went wide. Holy shit. Katerna called to Ryla. Did we lose him? Ryla had been staring at the war-ravaged planet too, her frills yellow. Quickly. She turned back towards the holographic map. She watched the chart intently. With each passing moment, their ship slowly inched ever so slightly towards the planet's surface. Suddenly, that infamous red dot blinked into view, tailed by 3 other dots. No. He's still on us. Katerna spun the holographic orb again. The craft pitched towards the planet. Beginning entry. Ryla froze. She watched as a wave of smaller, faster dots were launched towards their position. Missiles, they've fired 3 missiles at us. Ryla exclaimed. They're closing in on us. 5,000 miles. 4,000. We are lucky we managed to acquire a bounty hunter's ship, of all things. Katerna murmured. Deploying flares. The ship rattled as thousands of metal plates exploded from its back. Katerna continued to accelerate. Ryla waited as the missiles neared the debris cloud. No impact. They're still on us. Firing again. Katerna called. The ship shook again. An even larger wave of plates erupted from the back of the ship. Around the craft, blackness faded to blue as the ship entered the atmosphere of Marlala. Any effect? Ryla focused on the missile speeding towards the debris cloud. 1 dot vanished and the cloud became distorted. The other missiles continued, undeterred. 1 impact. But 2 still pursue us. Try spoofing our signal again. David suggested. Good thinking. Katerna acknowledged. Sending false signals. Ryla watched as one of the missiles suddenly changed course, sending it sailing in the opposite direction and exploding in midair. 2 missiles down. But there's still 1 to go. Clouds violently whipped by as the ship sliced through the atmosphere. David could hear the wind battering against the craft. We've depleted our supply of flares. Katerna said. Sending another false signal. It's not responding. Ryla yelled. It's closing in on us. 100 miles. 50. 25. Gods have mercy. Katerna uttered, briefly glancing upward. Prepare for impact. Before Ryla could brace herself, the missile slammed into the ship's rear thruster. The ship shook violently and the lights went out. The artificial gravity cut out entirely. Ryla was sent flying from her seat and slammed into the opposite wall as the craft started spinning out of control. She cried as she collided against her broken arm. Katerna fared only slightly better, being flung from the pilot's seat and sent skidding across the floor. Only David, through sheer strength, was able to hang on to a railing beside the dashboard. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. The cargo hold must have been breached. He didn't have time to think. Commander! GAIA yelled suddenly. The dashboard. David turned his attention towards the glowing holographic orb. Maybe, through gritted teeth, he moved across the railing as the ship continued to spin wildly. His arms ached and his body trembled. With a concerted grunt, he tried to seat himself at the dashboard, but he simply couldn't. A shout from Katerna drew his attention. Spin down and to the left. She yelled through whistling winds, down and to the left. Still gripping the railing with incredible strength, David managed to remove an arm to interface with the orb. With a strained grunt, he managed to spin the orb downwards. The ship instantly decelerated. Katerna was thrown towards the windshield, landing on it with a gruesome crack. Ryla was sent flying towards the dashboard, where she struck her head against the wall, knocking her out instantly. The ship rotated so that David could glimpse the open air. Smoke and debris trailed from the back of the ship. For a brief second, everything began to float. To the left, David spun the orb towards the left. Autopilot took control. The ship was reoriented. The surface revolved into view, an urban center. Tall, damaged spires stood erect and the city laid in smoking ruins. Brace yourselves. He shouted, to no response. GAIA was yelling at him, but it all became indistinguishable underneath the cacophony of noise. His eyes slammed shut as the ground grew nearer and nearer. The Lost Princess, Chapter 16, steam slowly rose from the hot water. Killier relaxed on the underwater steps, his eyes closed and his head tilted back against the ridge of the pool. The warm water and hot vapors of the indoor spa made for a rather pleasant experience. He was completely nude, leisurely stroking the surface of the water with his hand. The open-air spa itself was enormous, it occupied the footprint of a small skyscraper. The water was heated to absolute perfection, never scorching and never lukewarm. There was no ceiling, stars twinkled softly in the night sky above. Multiple, smaller pools surrounded the main body, but today they were empty. Killier was the only soul here. His solitude was interrupted by the sliding open of a door behind him. A guard stepped forward. Killier opened his eyes. My king. The guard bowed behind him. Yes? Killier asked. Liane Vosan has been brought here, per your request. Would you like her to join you? Absolutely. As you wish, my king. The guard bowed. He swiveled around and disappeared behind the door. Not once did Killier turn around to look at him. A pair of lighter footsteps entered the room, and the door slid shut shortly after. Killier swallowed, continuing to stare out at the foggy spa. Liane Vosan? Silence for a time, broken by a mild voice. Yes. He smiled. He still didn't turn around. Remove your clothes. More silence. Finally, he heard the clatter of beads and soft leather falling to the stony floor. Somehow, without looking, he was able to sense her posture. Her back was tense and her legs were crossed together. She was shivering. Please enter the water. A tense breath came from the girl. Slowly, she came into view, sitting at the ridge and slipping her long legs into the hot bath. She stopped halfway. Her shoulders were rigid and her body trembled. All the way. Liane complied. She lifted the rest of her body into the water. She sat on the underwater steps, beside Killier. She kept one arm crossed over her chest and another over her nether regions. Her frills flushed. Not once did she dare to look at him, but he couldn't take his eyes off her. He glazed over her. Hungry. Wanting. He drew in a breath and composed himself. I'm proud of you for coming here, Liane. No response. She simply stared ahead. He spread his legs further apart. Liane caught a curious glimpse, before quickly averting her eyes. Killier relaxed backward, obviously quite contented. Owning up to one's mistakes, it's a difficult task for most anyone. I'm glad you figured out that this was the right thing to do. Again, no response. I hear you are of the Vo family. He smiled. So am I. I suppose that makes us cousins, in a roundabout fashion. He leaned closer to her, he could feel his breath forming against her neck. I hear you have come to me with information that I may find useful. She swallowed. I want assurances. Doesn't everyone? Killier pondered aloud. He shook his head. You relinquished that privilege when you decided to run off with the princess and her psychotic aide. If you do not tell me the truth here and now, then your hopes will be dashed and I will excise the pertinent information from you by any means I deem necessary. But if you do tell me the truth, you will be able to live in safety for the rest of your life. You're a bright young girl. You can finish your schooling, find a man, raise a family, and live a peaceful life. But only if you tell me the honest truth. He held his hand up. But before we begin, I believe our records regarding you to be quite incomplete. Humor me with the context of your escape and your arrival here. Liane chewed on her cheek. I was an intern on these grounds. Record keeping, you see. The princess noticed me, she began talking with me. So you became her friend? I suppose. She murmured. This was about 6 years ago. I was still in school at the time. I suppose RYL the princess, looked up to me. I grew closer to her. Her closest handmaiden, Katerna, also took a liking in me. I suspended my education at that point and began working with the princess and her other aides full-time. Killier smiled, satisfied. And what has driven this nasty divorce? It's only something I've come to realize over these past few months in exile. Lien answered. She's young and lively. But she's also inexperienced. Impudent. She spent more time in her youth gallivanting across the kingdom with her friends than studying the royal court. But she's gained a more independent spirit since our escape. I was under the impression, at the start of all this, that Katerna would maintain the balance of power. That woman's probably smarter than you and I combined. But lately, she's been ceding more and more power to an immature princess, all while that very princess takes strides of increasing magnitude towards making her presence known. The princess. Killier began. Do you suppose she's aware of your deception? Lien shook her head ardently. No, I don't think she suspects me. I tried my best to stay out of her way. She's a real pleasant character, you see, but her current path. I fear for her safety. She stopped suddenly. She turned towards Killier. But there's something you don't know. And what is that? Around a month ago, an alien crashed not far from our settlement. She answered, an alien? Yes. Lien nodded. And an intelligent one, too. He belongs to species beyond our kingdom's borders, a human. He's extraordinarily strong and adept in battle, he could likely go toe-to-toe with your finest guards. He's a soldier, apparently, fighting some war against the core worlds. The princess has developed a sort of attraction towards him, and he towards her, I imagine, though I doubt they'll admit as much. It's not surprising really. He really has an allure to him. But it's he that has sparked this adventurous urge within her. Interesting. Killier leaned back, placing a speculative finger on his chin. A human. Interesting. His eyes narrowed. Now. The location of Princess Ryla. Lien drew in a deep breath. We have spent these past months on Scalata. Recently they decided to leave, they're searching for a way to return David to his people. They left for Barmanara station, though I doubt they're still there. By now, I imagine they've left, looking for a man who they believe can help them accomplish their goal. And where do they believe this man to be? Killier asked eagerly. Lien swallowed. Her head dipped. Tell me. Killier loomed. Lien looked up at him with a quivering lip. Marlala. It was Ryla that stirred first. Slowly, and quite painfully, she mustered the strength to peel her eyes open. She stared upwards, a dim, shadowy ceiling. The sun's setting rays poured through the cracked windshield, casting the cockpit in a tranquil orange glow. Night would be falling soon. Her senses gradually came back to her, the missile, the ship, the crash. She was alive. But how? Quite frankly, it was a miracle she was even breathing at this moment. All the more so when one took a second to consider how severely the craft had been spinning. She cautiously twisted her neck. No problems there, fortunately. She began to scan her surroundings. David. Katerna, realization, flooded her mind. Dazed and stumbling, she managed to hobble to her feet. She growled as she tested her broken arm, it began throbbing with pain with even slightest movement. She began her befuddled search. Her free hand searched for the walls and other identifiable indicators as to where she stepped. Ah, yes, there was the control dashboard. Bit by bit, her vision became more clear. Methodically and carefully, she inspected the rest of the floor. There was no one to be seen. Her frills flashed purple as she searched for clues. Her ears suddenly perked up, she heard voices outside. All right. There's two. You said you saw three? Came a male voice in a thick Marlolan accent. Yeah. A girl. Quite fetching, I dare say. Came a female voice in an even thicker accent. Don't go getting jealous, now. Pull her on out. Ryla froze. The sound of feet stepping onto metal reverberated throughout the ravaged ship. This woman was in the cargo hold. Her eyes darted around the cockpit. There wasn't a single thing she could use as a weapon. The footsteps drew closer. Ryla turned to face the open entry. Her eyes narrowed. Time to see if the sight of the crown meant anything in this new age. The woman turned the corner and caught the silhouette of the lost princess. She stopped dead in her tracks and trembled. The two stood like that for some time. In a single, sudden movement, the woman dropped to both her knees and tilted her head forward. "My princess." Ryla was yet to speak a single word. She watched with curiosity and newfound satisfaction as the woman wavered before her. Finally, after a moment, Ryla started towards her. She titled her head slightly. "Is your partner out there?" The woman nodded obediently. "Yes." "Will he try to attack me or my friends?" "Your friends." The woman briefly considered. She quickly shook her head. "No. He won't." "Good." Ryla nodded. "Rise and approach him first." The woman's head bobbed up and down. Quietly, she stood to her feet and, after casting a long glance at the princess, turned around and started out of the cargo hold. Ryla followed her shortly thereafter. The two stepped into the sunlight. The warm rays felt good against Ryla's back. Discreetly, she quickly scanned her environment. They'd landed in an industrial park of some kind. The tall spires that populated the city around the park stretched high into the sky. The city itself had largely been reduced to large gray heaps of rubble. The shells of domes that accompanied the spires had been caved in and the remains of towers stood vertical, albeit barely, their tops sheared off. The grass that they lightly trod upon, once pristinely manicured and trimmed to perfection, had become overgrown and untamed. The two stepped over bits and pieces of debris. Ryla caught a quick glimpse of the beetle-shaped vehicle Katerna had piloted. The streak of grass directly behind it had been totally upturned. Their crash had been a hard one. They were lucky the entire ship hadn't exploded upon impact. The sky was mostly clear, but she could still smell that horrible brown, smoky odor. She returned her attention to the scavenger woman that walked before her. "Jinsep." The woman began, slowly. "That person in the ship? You'll never believe who she is." "Lemme guess." He muttered. "What's her name?" "The lost princess?" Something." Ryla's eyes widened and her frills went red. David's and Katerna's bodies laid on the grass before the male, outstretched and limp. She quickly tried to recollect herself. The man turned to face the two women. Without missing a beat, he too fell straight to his knees. "Gods. My princess. Why, you're alive." "Are they dead?" Ryla asked curtly. She could feel her throat begin to swell. She sought desperately to keep her composure in check. Are they dead?" Ryla asked, more forcefully. The man cowered. "I believe not, my princess. They're alive, just unconscious." "Good," replied Ryla after some time with a relieved breath. She broke away from the woman and started towards the human and her aide. "Allow me." She knelt beside the two. She ran a hand through David's dark, tousled hair. He would never know. He looked so peaceful now. "What is that thing?" the woman asked. "A friend of mine, I suppose." She reminisced. "He's a human, from a world quite far from here." "David," she called gently. "David." The human began to stir. His eyes slowly opened to the sight of Ryla. He smiled warmly. "Good morning. It's almost nighttime." She smirked. "Well, good evening, then." He turned his head and took one long look at the ruins of their vehicle. He chuckled. "Can't believe it happened again." Ryla's head tilted confusedly. The human's gaze then fell upon the two bystanders. Instantly, he scrambled to his feet before stumbling and falling back towards the grass. Ryla tried to ease him with her hands, but to no avail. "Who are they?" he asked suspiciously. "They're good people." Ryla reassured him. She turned and glared at the two scavengers. "Right?" The two nodded fervently. "Yes, my princess. We're good." "Yes, we're good." David still eyed them suspiciously. Now Katerna began to stir. She placed a hand on her face. "Ugh. Gods. Whoa. Be careful now," the male advised. "You jostled your neck pretty hard there." Katerna could barely speak. "Princess." Who are these people? They helped you out of the crash. Here, take my hand. Katerina nodded weakly. She gripped Ryla's hand and slowly got to her feet. Careful. Careful. Ryla spoke gently. My princess, I assure you that I am quite well. Katerina said, stepping away from Ryla. She scanned their surroundings. She turned towards the two scavengers. You two. Your names. Tell me. Mavarna Dalcicis. The woman bowed. Their attention shifted to the male. He bowed too. Jinsep Tarkotheka. This place. Where are we? David asked. Calcutta district. Mavarna answered dutifully. Her face dropped. Or, what's left it? Katerina clearly wasn't in the mood for small talk. I, the princess and our alien guest, are here in search of a contact of mine. I fear I have been quite remiss. I haven't the chance to speak with him in over a decade, but I do believe that he still resides in the city of Talcata. Talcata, huh? Jinsep said, thoughtfully scratching his frills. He looked around and pointed in the direction of a partially collapsed spire. Talcata's about 5,000 miles in that direction. Do you have a ship? Ryla asked. Well, no. The man's eyes fell. He suddenly perked up. But I do know how to get one. There's an old military surplus base a few miles to our east. Mavarna chimed in. Place got blown up near the start, whole thing's caved in. But we did swing by there not a few days ago, and there looked to be a ship intact. Ryla considered this information. She looked to Katerina. What do you think? You're the princess. She replied simply. She shook her head. I don't see what other choice we have. And you? Ryla turned to David. He shrugged. Fine by me. Okay. Ryla nodded. She turned towards the two scavengers. Take us to this ship. The Lost Princess, Chapter 17. It was dusk by the time the five started towards the abandoned military base. Before departing, David retrieved GAIA from the wreckage of their ship, along with whatever supplies were still usable. Fortunately, their dwindling stock of food was supplemented by the light meals the scavengers carried in their small knapsacks. Even if they were not to find food inside the remains of the military base, what they had on their persons could sustain the group for at least a week. The route to the military base proved more difficult than Ryla had anticipated. Calcutta district, as explained to her by Jinsep, was home to a powerful anti-air system. When this became clear to the usurper's navy, Jinsep had once referred to Killier as the king in Ryla's presence. Before quickly correcting himself, the military opted to concentrate most of their fleet's firepower on the metropolis, eventually overwhelming the defenses and flattening the city, and flattened the city was. Where tall, proud, green structures once stood now sat piles of dusty rubble and a blanket of ash. The ghastly husks of buildings that had once been lively now loomed ominously as the scant light of the sun vanished behind distant mounds of debris. The optimal course laid out by Jinsep and Mavarna demanded that the five take several detours through these collapsed complexes. Ryla and Katerina's bare feet soon became raw and tender after hours of plodding over rubble, sometimes forcing the group to come to a halt, unfortunately. Neither had had the foresight to bring sandals. The darkness didn't make traversal any easier. The group only had the light of a small crescent moon and the combined intuition of the two scavengers to guide them. David, as it turned out, actually possessed fantastic night vision. He took charge in scouting for hazards, typically in the form of a blocked passage or a fallen pillar. Since crashing on the planet's surface and greeting her warmly, David had scarcely mentioned so much as a word to Ryla. He still seemed to be avoiding her, for what reason she did not know. She ultimately decided not to press the matter, not here, at least. They reached the military base at around midnight. A quick inspection, the structure indicated that there was no clear passage into the collapsed dome that supposedly housed the vehicles. A decision was made to delay the exploration of the site until the following morning. After all, neither Jinsep nor his partner had set out the previous day with the intention of staying out until the dead of night, and the trio from Scalata quite needed the rest. Yet, late that night, few seemed in the mood to go to sleep. Ryla laid on her back, her hands behind her head, staring up at the night sky. The air stunk of smoke and there was a haziness to the atmosphere. Beyond the wispy clouds and foggy haze hung an expanse of glittery stars. They seemed to twinkle, But there was something else, a grid of small, shimmering points of light. While the stars slowly made the journey across the sky, these points of light remained still, flashing ominously. Occasionally, she would catch a streak of light erupt from one of these points, quickly speeding through the atmosphere before disappearing behind the ruins of Calcutta. Once or twice, she would catch a point break away from the formation and drift away, only to be replaced by another point in due time. The usurper had gained complete control of the system. Marlala's navy had been thoroughly destroyed. There was no resistance, not up there, at least. If Killier so wanted, he could glass the surface and annihilate everyone, my princess. Started Mavarna suddenly, who sat opposite to her. For a while there, I thought you dead. Ryla sat up. The flames of the fire that David had hastily established lit their faces with a soft, orange glow. The fire crackled and sputtered, sending out a puff of embers as a chunk of charred wood fell. Mavarna grabbed a fresh chunk of wood and added it to the conflagration. The group had taken refuge in a debris-laden public square outside of the military base. Dead? Yeah. That seems to be the common impression. Ryla frowned, candidly. Her eyes fell to the polished marble ground that they sat upon. Where were you? Scalata. Ryla answered simply. Mavarna thought for a moment before shaking her head. Never heard of it. Neither had I, and I'm the princess. Ryla smiled. Mavarna chuckled in response. The princess let out a deep breath. A twinge of regret crossed her mind, all that she could have done to prevent this. From listening to her tutors and aides more closely to obliging her father when he offered to show her the ropes of the palace. Nothing was ever guaranteed. Perhaps their present condition was inevitable, but maybe things could have turned out differently. Maybe. What was it like here? Ryla asked. Once we heard that all of our fleets had been defeated, the governor issued an order demanding that places likely to be targeted by the bombardment be evacuated. Mavarna began. She glanced around their surroundings. As you can probably imagine, Calcutta was one of those targets. So you didn't evacuate? I didn't live here. She responded. In fact, I've only been here a few times in my life. Ryla flicked a pebble into the fire. Her eyes met Mavarna's. So why are you here? My den mother. The scavenger answered. Your what? Now, I don't mean to sound discourteous to royal folk such as yourself. Mavarna began. Dens are quite common along the fringes of the kingdom. Pilgrims and freedom and the age of expansion. All that, you know. The term did ring a bell, to use the euphemism David had once used earlier. Something about religious zealots heading out to the periphery ages ago. A few of those sects, if she remembered correctly, were quite communal. I'm a Karkman by birth, you see. Mavarna said, showing a beaded bracelet that wrapped around her wrist. There aren't many of us on Marlala, but we do have a few colonies. My den mother, she took care of me after my real mother left to train. She explained. I moved out once I came of age. At some point, my den mother must have relocated here. I received a message from her caretakers. They couldn't get her to leave the den. So I came down here to help them out. By the time I arrived, the city had been flattened. So, did you find? Ryla asked cautiously. No. Mavarna quickly shook her head. The den was an empty pile of rubble by the time I arrived. I'm assuming they got her out, hoping, anyway. Since then, we've just been looking for a way out of the city. Ryla nodded. Her gaze returned to the flames reaching up, licking at the air. Her attention shifted to Jinsep. He dozed peacefully beside the woman, sleeping like a rock. His flabby chest rose up and down. Ryla gestured towards him with her head. How's he in the picture? Mavarna smiled. Oh, Jinsep. Now she showed off a scar along the palm of her other hand. My husband. He's a sweet soul, quite aloof at times, but he's more intelligent than his drawl might indicate, and he's always dependable. I've known him since I was little. We were part of the same den, in fact. Now, if I may ask. Mavarna started. What's going on between you and the alien? Ryla looked over to where Mavarna had pointed. David was standing some ways across the square, alone, his back against a half-toppled marble pillar and his arms folded across his chest. He had promised to stay up overnight and watch over the group, though they had not encountered a single solitary soul during their entire trek across the city. Ryla quickly shook her head. Absolutely nothing, that much I can assure you. I suppose it's true then. Mavrana stared. What's true? The scavenger chuckled. That all the royals are liars. Ryla felt her frills grow warmer. Oh, please. I saw that smile he gave you when you first woke him up. Mavarna continued. He likes you, princess. A lot. I don't know what he's doing now, there's some sort of game going on between the two of you. Believe me, Ryla started. There's absolutely not, I'm not blaming you. Mavarna said. She cupped her hands firmly around her husband's ears. He didn't stir at all. I'm not blind, and you're not either. I'm sure you're seeing the same creature I am. He's better looking than that Killier fellow, anyhow. Please. Ryla said. I mean, he's alien. There's no way. Let me tell you a tale. Mavarna said. Jinsep here, about 10 years ago now, I'd say, he was drafted by the army. They came in, plucked him right out of the den, and took off. Pardon my language, but I was fucking devastated. We'd known each other since we were little. I felt for him. Cared for him, you know. The night before they were set to take him away, I realized that I loved him. He was the first and only man to ever make me feel that way. So I slipped a message in his bag, a love letter, you know. Told him how I felt. Nothing to elaborate, you know, just short and sweet. This was back when that rebellion on Karnak was all over the news. I was sure I'd never see him again. Sure enough, he wound up on Karnak, wading through piles of bodies in some god's-forsaken swamp. A rocket strike took out of his crew, and whatever survivors there were picked off, one by one. He was alone and surrounded by rebels. There were hundreds of them crawling around in that bog, and they weren't known for taking prisoners. So he hid. He spent 7 weeks in that swamp, living in the most filthy conditions imaginable. When he came home a year later, he told me it was my letter that kept him going that whole while, that deep down, he felt the same way about me. Both of their eyes fell on Jinsep, sleeping peacefully and soundly. Ryla's gaze returned to the silhouette of the human. Standing stoically by the pillar, princess. There is always a way. Mavarna said. But first, you have to let him know how you really feel. Ryla nodded. Her attention lingered on David for some time. He didn't seem to notice. After some time, she silently laid back and rested her head atop her hands. Now she had even more to think about.